Okay, so actually, I need to get this the right side. That makes a little better sense. Okay. We're almost done with the semester. We have David Hume and Immanuel Kant. And maybe I should remind you before I forget that our next reading is the last one. It is pages 717 to 742. Kant, I will warn you, is, like, you probably already think this already, but he's very hard to understand. If you've had a taste of Kant, you may have read a little bit of Kant in like your intro to philosophy class, maybe Groundwork of Morals. Groundwork of Morals is like the easy Kant, which if you've read that, that was already very hard. So this is pretty hard stuff we're about to do. I have posted on Moodle a little assignment for you to do with Kant. So I've posted a series of questions, 23 questions, that will guide you through the reading. I'm not going to ask you to answer 23 questions about Kant. I'm not that evil. What I will do, though, is I want you to answer 5. So out of the 23 questions, pick 5, and they're divided by different like chapters and sections and parts. You can't do more than 2 of questions per part. So I'm trying to get you to distribute the load across there. And why do I give you all these questions for this? Partly so that you can also, it'll help you with the reading. So I'm not going to ask you to answer every single one and turn that in for a grade. But you might want to try, at least take notice of these questions. That'll help guide you through the reading and give you something specific to lock onto for what you're doing. And that can be either typed up or handwritten, and we'll just take that at the beginning of our next class. Sound good? Any questions about next week's reading and homework? Then, what I want to do is have us look at parts of this reading, an inquiry concerning human understanding. As the group just told you in the biography of Hume, Hume originally wrote this huge book called A Treatise of Human Nature in his 20s. And the way Hume describes it is that it was, when it came off the press, stillborn. Meaning that he wrote this exciting thing, a very revolutionary idea that was filled with like skeptical ideas, it was a very different kind of philosophy. He was expecting everyone who read this to turn around and like respond to it and talk about it. And nobody did. It was like it never happened. And it was very disappointing for him. So a few years later, he writes these other books. One of them is An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And in this one is the part mainly about his theory of knowledge. He wrote another one called An Essay Concerning Human Morals that is about his moral theory. The main themes I want us to take away from this is his version of empiricism and his version of skepticism. Based on the sort of line of history we've been tracing, I tried to tell you last time that Berkeley was essentially taking Locke to his logical conclusion. Well, Hume is going to take Berkeley to his logical conclusion. There are some aspects of this that are actually really interesting that we didn't read and we're not going to talk about. But one of the things, for instance, is that Hume argues that there's no self. So Berkeley thought there are no material objects, but there's still like a self that is having these perceptions. Hume says when Descartes does the whole I think, therefore I am, Hume says I don't know what this I is supposed to be. I think, therefore, there are thoughts, is what he would say. When I look inward and I try to find the self that makes me an individual, he says I don't find anything. All I find are different feelings, thoughts, beliefs, emotions. But that's not, where's the self in all that? All I find are just these fleeting ideas and feelings. So he concluded there must not be a self. That was one of the kind of controversial things that he thought more people would be interested in talking about, and no one did. I want us to talk about his theory of knowledge. If you have your book, open it up and let's look at some of these things that he's bringing our attention to on 539. One of the things, the very first thing he kind of does in the opening of this reading I had you do is look at the difference between ideas and impressions. And this will correspond loosely to the things that Locke has said about the difference between two kinds of ideas as well. So look on 539. I want to read a little bit of the paragraph that's on the bottom part on the left side. He says, "Here, therefore, we may divide all the perceptions of the mind into two classes or species, which are distinguished by their different degrees of force and vivacity. The less forcible and lively are commonly denominated thoughts or ideas. The other species want a name in our language, and in most others, I suppose, because it was not requisite for any but philosophical purposes to rank them under a general term or appellation. Let us therefore use a little freedom and call them impressions, employing that word in a sense somewhat different from the usual. By the term impression, then, I mean all our more lively perceptions, when we hear or see or feel or love or hate or desire or will. The impressions are distinguished from ideas, which are the less lively perceptions of which we are conscious when we reflect on any of those sensations or movements above mentioned." So here we have ideas and impressions. All he says about ideas, they are less forceful and lively, and of impressions, those are more forceful and lively. What he wants, here's another way to think about this, and the idea here is that ideas are copies of impressions. Impressions are the experiences that you are having sort of immediately, what you're having right now. It's that present moment experience. And he talks about them coming from the outward experience and inward experience. None of this should sound too revolutionary because this sounds a lot like Locke. And I think that's exactly right. He's just following in Locke's footsteps. And then he says, I have this quote here, it's on the other side on 539, that all the materials of thinking are derived from either our outward or our inward sentiment. So every idea you have either comes from, the way Locke would put it, from sensation or reflection. This just means that Hume is another empiricist, just like Locke. So ideas are are copies of what he calls impressions. So everything that is in your mind is either an immediate impression you're having right now, or it's like a copy of those impressions, either a memory or the way in which you can, through imagination, dream up new and interesting thoughts that are combinations of your previous impressions. Locke says that there are essentially two proofs of empiricism that we find in this section. One of them is that all of our ideas can be traced to simple parts that are derived from experience. So you can't find a single idea, a single thing in your mind that is not traceable to experience. We tried this a little bit with Locke. Maybe I could try this again, but can you think of anything, any idea, any thought that is not traceable to an experience? Something you can think about that you've never experienced. If I wanted to think about, and we may have done this with Locke, but it's not a bad review. If I want to think about a golden mountain, how is that possible since I've never experienced a golden mountain? What do you think he would want to say? Yeah?
Because you've experienced mountains and you've experienced gold separately, so your mind can combine the two.
So I'm able, the idea is still from experience because the basic component parts are still from experience. The other argument he gives, once again, is similar to what Locke says, which is that without the source of experience, there's no corresponding idea. If you're born blind, you have no idea of color. If you're born deaf, you have no idea of sound. This seems to be a very strong indicator. Where do the ideas come from? They've got to come from the experience. If you got them some other way, then you can be able to have those ideas apart from the experiences. Here's something a little different, though, that he brings up on 540. He brings up this case of the missing shade of blue. Let's take a look at this. This sounds like a Hardy Boys novel, The Missing Shade of Blue. So look on the bottom left. I'm going to read a good portion of this on 540, the bottom left paragraph, and let's take our way through most of this, and then I'm going to ask you what's going on in this passage. You'll notice this is some kind of problem for empiricism, but let's see what you think about this. There is, however, one contradictory phenomenon which may prove that it is not absolutely impossible for ideas to arise independent of their correspondent impressions. I believe it will readily be allowed that the several distinct ideas of color which enter by the eye, or those of sound which are conveyed by the ear, are really different from each other, though at the same time resembling. Now, if this is true of different colors, it must be no less so of the different shades of the same color. And each shade produces a distinct idea, independent of the rest. For if this should be denied, it is possible by the continual gradation of shades to run a color insensibly into what is most remote from it. And if you will not allow any of the means to be different, you cannot without absurdity deny the extremes to be the same. Suppose, therefore, a person to have enjoyed his sight for 30 years, and to have become perfectly acquainted with colors of all kinds, except one particular shade of blue, for instance, which it never has been his fortune to meet with. Let all the different shades of that color, except that single one, be placed before him. Descending gradually from the deepest to the lightest, it is plain that he will perceive a blank where that shade is wanting, and will be sensible that there is a greater distance in that place between the contiguous colors than in any other. Now I ask, whether it is possible for him, from his own imagination, to supply this deficiency, and raise up to himself the idea of that particular shade, though it had never been conveyed to him by his senses? Here's his answer. I believe there are few, but will be of the opinion that he can. So, maybe first, the basic thing he's getting at is he thinks that it's possible for somebody who has never experienced some particular shade of blue to figure it out just by comparing the ideas he already has. But if you can do that, then you can come up with some new idea apart from experience. Two questions for you to think about, for us to discuss right now. One, do you think somebody could do this? Do you think somebody could figure out the missing shade of blue without ever experiencing it? And secondly, do you think that's inconsistent with empiricism? Sarah?
Wouldn't we all come up with a different color, like shade of blue? Like it could be between those two there, but wouldn't everyone's perception be different of what color would go there?
How could we all be different if it was the shade that lies right between those two? Are there several colors between them?
Different variation of it?
We might think there might be maybe a range of colors, and maybe that. Suppose you're right. That's still kind of consistent with Hume would say. Do you think that people wouldn't have a problem coming up with a brand new color, even if we didn't all come up with the exact same one? We could still do it. Yeah, Rob.
As the shade goes, someone can think of like maybe a little bit darker of a shade, and then I might think it's a little lighter of a shade because you can't really see. They're exactly going at the same rate.
Yeah, if you need to look on the computer screen, it's more nicely done. It's just the projector's fault here. But you could. The point is the same. The visual isn't exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
Suppose you had it done perfectly right. Would you be able to conjure up that new image? Yeah.
I think that the question that you asked, is that inconsistent with empiricism?
Right.
I think that it would be inconsistent with empiricism because you wouldn't need experience to imagine that shade in between that one blue and the other. It's more of a like strategic kind of I forget, I'm trying to think of the word, but I can't think of the word. It's more of a strategic thing than an experience thing, because how many times do you experience that color in between those two colors exactly? You might not have ever experienced it. So I think that it's kind of inconsistent with the whole idea of empiricism. You kind of just are going in a sequence.
Brianna, you had your hand for a moment.
Well, in order to defend empiricism, couldn't you argue that you're to get the missing shade, you're combining your experience of several of the shades already on the screen?
Yeah, so you might think that you're just kind of blending what you already got, right? And that maybe that's how we come up with the new color. To which I might say, do you think maybe this is not what Hume had in mind, but if you have the idea of red and the idea of blue, do you think you could conjure up the idea of purple without ever experiencing it?
No, absolutely not.
Now, you say absolutely not. Do you feel pretty comfortable in this case, or do you think this is also...
It's all blue. You know it has to be darker than the left side, and you know it has to be lighter than the right side. So he's kind of narrowing it down for you.
You had your hand for a while, Phil. I didn't mean to skip over you.
No, sorry. I was just going to say, could it be like in defense of empiricism? You could say it's like a combination of sensation and reflection, which is what Locke has been saying. Like you're going to sense both of those shades of blue in between, and then you can use maybe reflection to somehow combine them, which I think would still fall under empiricism. You're getting it through experience.
So this would be kind of, I think, what Brianna is also suggesting, the same kind of strategy, that you've got enough in experience, and with reflection we can generate that new idea. Yeah.
I was just, it came to my head, aren't there only like 3 real colors, like red, blue, and green? And all the other colors are just shades of yellow?
Yeah. Green is a combination of blue and yellow.
Yeah, you're right. And all the other ones are just like shades in between them?
Well, I don't know if that's, somebody who's an art major may actually be able to correct us on this, but I wouldn't call them shades, but they're different combinations of them. I don't know, is there any art majors in here who can correct me and tell me how we should be thinking about these colors? I know we talked the 3 primary colors, and then you can derive all colors from those 3.
It's the primary color lights up, that's green. Yellow is pigment.
Personally, I think what you guys mean is the secondary colors of the green, the purple, and orange kind of deal. That's what you're looking for.
So could we derive secondary, could we come up with the visualization of secondary colors just by knowing the primary colors? Most people are skeptical. Carlos was downright, skeptical. But some people may not be. What were you going to say, Amanda?
I forgot what I was going to say.
Now, let me ask you, do you still think we could come up with this new shade if we didn't know all of these? If all we knew were these 3 shades, do you think we could come up with the next one in the sequence? Or do you need to have the one on the other side in order to form that new color, that new shade?
Yeah, I think because you kind of have both boundaries to form the new shade, where if you didn't have it, you wouldn't have that it needs to be darker than that color.
If you bite on this and you say otherwise, I don't see. Then it seems like we could generate a whole series of new ideas out of this. Like we could blend one color gradually into another. We could learn just through progressive thoughts how to get to the next one. That seems outlandish. Yeah.
I have a question. What is Hume saying exactly? Like, is he saying that we can't come up with that color on our own?
He says you can. This is sort of the shocking thing. You think as an empiricist who just said all of our ideas can be traced to these other parts that are derived from experience, that he would then say, now if you've never experienced something, you can't come up with that idea. But he says, yes, you can. And the same thing goes, another interesting analogy here is with music. He does this with, he briefly mentions music here. Do you think that you could come up with the missing musical note? Like if you've never heard any sound before, the first sound you hear is like do, re, fa, so. Like, so is a little long. But do you think you could come up with the mi, which was me, in between re and fa there, without ever having heard those sounds before? Could you come up with the tone that belongs in there?
What if you're toned down?
Well, you don't have to reproduce it. What if you could just think it, right? You can just produce the sound, so to speak, in your own mind. Do you think that's possible? The same thing goes with the color, right? I'm not asking you to produce the color. I'm just asking you to think about, could you imagine that color without ever experiencing it?
I feel like it's different with, like, I feel like the color, you can imagine it in place. I don't know. I feel like if you never experienced music, you couldn't. I don't know why. I'm contradicting myself.
Well, the reason I bring it is interesting because we do sometimes get different intuitions about the two cases. So I think it is helpful to think about the two cases here. This frustrates so many people because, for one, there's some people that have the view that they think you can do this with experience. You don't need to say what Hume said. They're sort of annoyed because they maybe like empiricism in some cases. And so they say, Hume didn't have to make this concession. But here's the other annoying thing. Let's go back to where I just finished reading on 540. So this is what Hume says in response to this problem. And this may serve as a proof that the simple ideas are not always, in every instance, derived from the correspondent impressions. Though, here's what really annoys people, this instance is so singular that it is scarcely worth our observing, and does not mean that for it alone we should alter our general maxim. So what did he just say there about this?
He just dismissed it.
Pretty much said, here's a problem with my view. Something that my view says shouldn't happen. But it happens. But it's such a small thing, let's just forget about it for now. Doesn't that seem so dismissive? But this so what is the point? What do you think the point is for this? I think it's him trying to say we shouldn't get so hung up on these little kinds of things. If you have a philosophical theory that does a lot of explaining, and then somebody comes up with some very trivial example that is supposed to undo your whole philosophy, well, that really shouldn't stop us from thinking there's a lot of good in your work. You can find a ton of philosophy that is written about the missing shade of blue if you are ever interested in continuing looking into this. Let's move on. So, another interesting thing about Hume's empiricism is that he wants to say that there's some value in the way that he's thinking about ideas being copies of impressions. So since all of our ideas are copies of impressions, we can resolve philosophical problems by asking, and let's take a look at this. I've got the answer here. From what impression is that supposed idea derived? Let's look at this on 540, 541. Let's start about middle of where that is on 540. He says, the limits between them are more exactly determined, nor is it easy to fall into any error or mistake with regard to them. When we entertain, therefore, any suspicion this is really the key part, that a philosophical term is employed without any meaning or idea, as is but too frequent, we need but inquire, from what impression is that supposed idea derived? And if it is impossible to assign any, this will indeed serve to confirm our suspicion. By bringing ideas into so clear a light, we may reasonably hope to remove all dispute which may arise concerning their nature and reality. So people bring up stuff, like philosophers throw around terms like substance or property, cause, freedom, virtue, goodness. Hume is going to ask, when people start bringing up strange philosophical terms or things that are used in different ways, he would say, let's see if we can trace back, where do we get that idea from? Can we find the impressions that give us those ideas? And if we can, that will help us understand what the idea means. If we can't find it, then he's basically saying they're making, they're not making it up, but they don't know what they're talking about. And we should just ignore it. So his method is supposed to help us in thinking more clearly and more philosophically. And one of the things, if we read all of this, the very last chapter, very last section of this, very last line of the whole work, he basically says that if some book makes metaphysical claims that we can't find where they come from, we should throw the book into the flames, that it's a waste of our time. So, in a way, he's like an anti-philosopher. He's one of these philosophers who says metaphysics is a waste of time because people talk about stuff that really we don't know where it comes from. They're spinning ideas out of nothing. In the next section, we're going to look at 3 different relations that he says there are between our ideas. And maybe the key thing to think about this is not just that he likes these 3 relations, but he's saying these are it. Ideas in the mind can only be related to one another in these 3 ways. One is by resemblance. And he says, a picture naturally leads our thoughts to the original. So, an idea can resemble another idea. And resemblance is not a perfect match. It's just there are certain ways in which actually things can be like loose matches in resemblance. My 1-year-old daughter resembles my 3-year-old daughter, but they're not identical. The second relation is contiguity, which is this is how he describes it. The mention of one apartment building naturally introduces an inquiry concerning the others. One way to think about this is the way in which things are associated with one another, maybe spatially, maybe temporally. If I show you the front side of the bottle, you could think about the back side of the bottle. Not because the front side resembles the back, or the front side is the cause of the back, but because there's a contiguity of the bottle, the front side and the back side. Even though you're not looking at the back side, by seeing the front side, it could lead you to think about the back side. And then the third, and probably the most important one for our upcoming discussion, is cause and effect. He says, if we think of a wound, we can scarcely forbear reflecting on the pain which follows it. Now, this is something that we might doubt. This morning, I don't know if you can really see, I was scraping ice off my car because Mother Nature decided to give us a snowstorm last night. And I actually ended up, this morning as I was scraping, my hands were numb, and I ended up cutting my knuckles. And I didn't discover that till I got to work. It seems like I can think about these wounds without feeling any pain. When I was 6 years old, I got hit by a car. I know that explains it all. And I can think about that event without feeling the pain. Maybe this is just maybe this is just a bad example, although there are other things that we can, where this cause and effect really is tied together a little more closely. If I have you think about, I may have done this in this class already, but I ask you to think about a really, really, bright yellow sour lemon. I tell you to think about taking a big bite out of that. If you think about it real vividly, you can't have that thought without puckering up a little bit, and getting, just a little bit of like you're about to bite into that lemon, a little of that sour taste. Maybe that's just all he's saying, is that there are certain ideas which cause us to have other ideas. And that's it. So one thing to think about with this is to think that when he says that there are these three relations between ideas, these are the only possible ways that he can see that one idea could be related to another. Nothing else. Any questions about these three relations between ideas? Yeah?
What would be like if you ate something sour and you thought of a lemon, but it's not a lemon? What would that be?
So, like if somebody gave you a lime and you thought it was a lemon?
Well, like if you bit it and you're like, oh, this is sour, it tastes like a lemon.
Somebody gives you like lemon head candy?
Yeah, like if it leads you to think of a lemon, but it's not.
That would probably, I think, would be resemblance. That it would remind you of a lemon, but you wouldn't mistake it for a lemon. Other thoughts on this? So let's take a brief break, and then we will pick up here at 6:30. Are there any leftover questions or thoughts about Hume on his empiricism and the relations of ideas that we just went over? So here's section 4 is actually the more interesting, I would say is the most interesting part of our whole reading. This is what tonight is all about. Section 4 is titled On Skeptical Doubts Concerning the Operations of the Understanding. This is one of Hume's famous skeptical arguments that I want us to spend some time thinking about. Before we get into the skepticism, we've got some vocabulary. He introduces us to first what he calls relations of ideas. And the contrary to this, or the comparison with that, is what he calls matters of fact. Relations of ideas are things that he says you can discover by thinking alone. You don't need any additional experience to figure out any of these claims. And relations of ideas are such that the contraries of them are impossible. Typically, these are found in truths from geometry, algebra, or arithmetic. For example, all triangles have 3 sides. You can't imagine, all triangles have 3 sides. It would be impossible to imagine a triangle that has more or less than 3 sides. You can't do that. If you know what a triangle is, then it follows it's got to have 3 sides. Now, the other kind of thing is what he calls a matter of fact. A matter of fact is, according to him, founded on reasoning by cause and effect, which are known by experience. And the contraries of these sorts of truths are possible. So one of the examples he gives is the claim that the sun will rise tomorrow. Something we all believe, the sun will rise tomorrow. But we can imagine that tomorrow it doesn't happen. It's possible, in some sense, that tomorrow the sun won't rise and it's the end of the world, for us at least. So, matters of fact are different than relations of ideas in these ways. Relations of ideas are things you know just through thought alone. It's absolutely certain. And matters of fact, by the other hand, are just things that you know through cause and effect reasoning, and and all of these sorts of things are possibly false. Yeah.
Isn't the relations of ideas similar to what Leibniz was getting at a while back?
Exactly. So what did Leibniz call those? Do you remember?
Necessary, I think.
He called them truths of, do you remember?
I don't remember.
Reason.
No, reason.
Truths of reason and then truths of fact. These are exactly, in fact, the connection you made is the exact one I wanted someone to make, which is, this is the exact same distinction. I don't know if Hume read Leibniz, but they definitely are carving out the exact same distinction here. So, here's a question for us to consider, or a topic for us to ponder. It may therefore be a subject worthy of curiosity to inquire, what is the nature of that evidence which assures us of any real existence and matter of fact beyond the present testimony of our senses, or the records of our memories? In other words, so for relations of ideas, when you understand them, there's really no doubt about their truth. But what about matters of fact? If these are all claims that we could imagine could be false. They're also the more interesting claims in our lives. Claims about, there's a person sitting next to me. Why do you believe that? Because you believe that this idea in your mind of the person next to you is caused by some person who's actually sitting next to you. It's not just a hallucination or an illusion. You think, when I go out to my car and I turn the key in the ignition, I think my car is going to start. Why? Because, well, that's a good question, why? That's what he wants to inquire. But you don't have any doubt about that the turning of the key will cause the starting of the car. Unless you have a really bad car, in which you might have some doubts. But most of us, we're pretty sure it's going to start. Another way to think about this is, how do we go from our knowledge of what we observe to what we have not observed? And notice the way that he puts this in the quote here. The nature of the evidence which assures us of any real existence and matter of fact beyond the present testimony of our senses. In other words, to those things we have yet to observe. This is sometimes thought of as what's called the problem of induction. The problem of induction tries to get us to see the connection, or figure out how do we go from a claim like number 1, all observed P's are Q. So what do I mean by that? Like, all observed ravens are black. But we conclude, therefore, all, even the unobserved ravens, are black. But we haven't observed every single raven in the universe, right? There surely have been some ravens that have existed that no human being has observed. But we think that it's rational to think of that raven, or those ravens, that they're black, just like all the other ones. What's the connection between all the things we have observed and all the things we have, and the same things that we have not observed? Why think that they are similar? One of the examples that Hume uses in this essay is about eating and food. That you think the next piece of bread that you're going to bite into is going to nourish you. But how do you know it's not going to kill you? So, what this debate is really about, in a way, I think, is trying to come up with a way to justify a claim like number 2 here. That unobserved things will resemble the observed things. That why do we think the ravens we have yet to observe will be black? Because there's some resemblance, there's some pattern, there's some connection between what I've observed and what I've not observed. Since all the ravens I have observed up till now have been black, we think that's good grounds for thinking the unobserved raven will be black. Since all the bread I've eaten up till now has been nourishing, I think, well, then the next piece of bread that is sufficiently like all the other ones will also be nourishing. But Hume is going to say there's no possible reason you could give for thinking that a claim like number 2 is true. In fact, what he's going to try to argue in this case is that if we are depending on reason to inform us about this, that you're just as reasonable in thinking that the next raven will be black as you would also be thinking the next raven will be white or blue or purple. That there's really no rational basis for thinking that the next raven is going to be black. There's no rational basis for thinking the next time you turn your car key, it's going to start your car. There's no rational basis for thinking that the sun will rise tomorrow. There is no rational basis for thinking that when the next piece of bread you eat is going to nourish you. Could just as well kill you. Let's see what his reasoning is. So for Hume, the answer to our question is there's no good reasoning that can show why we should believe number 2. This takes us back, though, to our vocabulary we just learned. So section 4 is divided into 2 parts. The first part is aimed at showing that the claim that unobserved things will resemble observed things, it cannot be known or justified as a relation of ideas. And I put out in parentheses here the idea that it can't be justified a priori, meaning a priori means apart from experience, just conceptually alone. And here's roughly how he argues in the first part. He says, if this were true, like if you really could figure out the effect from some cause just by knowing the causes, then you could deduce that the effect would follow from the cause just by contemplating those ideas and imagining what must follow. And of course, he says that's crazy. His example is with billiard balls. And I want to read this on 543 on the right side. If you look at the middle paragraph on 543, we're going to start just a little bit below halfway into that one. So he says, we fancied that were we brought all of a sudden into the world, we could at first have inferred that one billiard ball would communicate motion to another upon impulse, and that we did not need to have waited for the event in order to pronounce with certainty concerning it. Such is the influence of custom that where it is strongest, it not only covers our natural ignorance, but even conceals itself and seems not to take place. And what he goes on to illustrate with this is, I mean, the idea is this. Suppose you were just brought into existence as a fully mature being all at once. And your very first experience that you're going to observe is one billiard ball about to strike a second one. Hume says, before it strikes the second billiard ball, would you be able, if you've never had any past experiences of these things, or any physical objects interacting with one another, would you be able to figure out what's going to happen when they make contact? His answer is no, you wouldn't know it. You don't know when they make contact so if it's the cue ball hitting the 8 ball. You don't know if when the cue ball strikes the 8 ball, if the cue ball is just going to bounce right back at you. Or if when the cue ball hits the 8 ball, that it just comes to a complete stop and neither one moves again. You don't know if when the cue ball hits the 8 ball that they just burst into flames. You don't know if when the cue ball hits the 8 ball just goes straight up in the middle of the air. If you've never experienced these things, you have no idea what one thing is going to cause the other thing to do. The only way you learn that is through experience.
What about if you hadn't experienced that, but you had experienced physics?
What do you mean by experienced physics?
Not so much as experienced physics, I guess, but know about it. If you hit a ball and you use like force equals mass times acceleration, you could figure out what's going to happen with the other ball.
So you could if you had enough background knowledge of physics, but ultimately that knowledge has to be eventually grounded in the experience of it. Whoever wrote that book or came up with those laws did it because they observed it. They didn't just think about it and come up with it.
Right. Okay.
And that's all Hume's point is for now, is that you can't deduce the effect of something just by thinking about its cause. In essence, he's also trying to say causes are distinct from their effects. One of the things that may have been a prominent idea prior to Hume was this idea that in some way effects are contained within their causes. So that if you just really thought about a cause, maybe you could think about the effect that was, because the effect was sort of included in the cause. So that some way, like in a match head, the fire is somehow literally contained within the match head, and when you strike it, you're just sort of like unlocking it, releasing it. What Hume is saying is that that's not true, that causes are different and distinct things from their effects. And really, any two things could be causally related to one another. There's nothing special, for instance, when I come over here and I push down on these switches, that it turns the lights off. And when I push them up, the lights come on. We could have wired these switches such that when I push those things down, that it opens the windows. Or that when I flip the switch, that it turns the projector off. I mean, there's nothing intrinsic, there's no intrinsic connection between the cause and the effect. It's just a contingent relationship. It's just something that happens to be so. But we could have wired it up any other way. And the same thing goes for causes in nature. Things could have been different in nature. There was no necessary reason why these things had to be connected in this way. Why we can come up with, for instance, with mathematical models of physics, where when you do have the billiard ball hit the other one, it bounces back. Let's take a look at his conclusion to this section, because this is not really the most important part of his argument, but it's important to cover because it covers all of his bases. So look on 544, on the left-hand side, that little paragraph that starts with "in a word" there. It says, "In a word, then, every effect is a distinct event from its cause. It could not therefore be discovered in the cause in the first invention or conception of it, a priori. It must be entirely arbitrary. And even after it is suggested, the conjunction of it with the cause must appear equally arbitrary, since there are always many other effects which to reason must seem fully as consistent and natural. In vain, therefore, should we pretend to determine any single event or infer any cause or effect without the assistance of observation and experience." Bottom line, you can't figure out causes, you can't figure out effects just by contemplating causes. The only way you can figure out effects and how they're related to their causes is to make several observations. So, the point he's trying to make stands. You cannot unobserved things will resemble observed things. That claim cannot be known or justified just by thinking about them, just by contemplating those thoughts as relations of ideas. Any questions about anything in part 1 from section 4 here? Is that a hand?
Sort of.
Okay.
Thinking, how does that account for like the laws of physics that we were talking about? Like an object will continue unless it acts upon. Because in our experience, like you throw something and then it eventually stops. So how does this reconcile that?
So what he would want to say is that, I mean, the laws of physics would have to be informed through experience. Like we couldn't just come up with laws of physics apart from, we can't just theorize them apart from making observations about how objects move. So is your question more specific to trying to zero in on it? Like I feel like I'm missing that.
I don't know. How would he? Maybe I should just learn how to explore how, I guess, like Galileo thought.
So I mean, like for instance, we theorize things based on friction. You know, friction in the air, friction with contact on the ground. That perfect laws of physics work in like frictionless, environments. But everything has varying degrees of friction, and that explains why there are, why objects eventually stop rolling and so forth.
So we got that idea by thinking about what would happen if you took away friction and other stuff.
Right.
All right.
So the second part is then the one that probably you think if there is a way to justify cause and effect relationships, it's got to be through experience. However, Hume is going to say you can't get it that way either. Let's see how this is supposed to go. So, section 4, part 2, what he's saying is that the claim that unobservable things will resemble observed things, it cannot be known or justified as a matter of fact, meaning through experience. So you might, the first thing I might say, if I were to try to get you to say, well, why think that the unobserved raven is black? And you would say, because all the observed ones are black. Or if I say tomorrow, why do you think the sun is going to rise? You're going to say, because in the past, the sun has always risen. In other words, my past experience, isn't that good evidence for future experiences? As to past experience, Hume tells us, it can be allowed to give a direct and certain information of those precise objects only, and that precise period of time which fell under its cognizance. But why this experience should be extended to future times and to other objects, which for all we know may be only similar in appearance. So one of the things that Hume is raising here is that, what does your past experience tell you? It tells you about the past, and that's it. Just because every observed raven is black, it doesn't mean that an unobserved raven, that the ravens we've yet to observe will have to be black. It might be, maybe, purple ravens are shy creatures, and so they stay away from people. There was this problem, people thought in Europe for the longest time that all swans are white. Why is that? Because every swan they had observed was a white swan. But, anybody know where there are different colored swans?
In Australia.
And what color are they?
Black.
Yeah. In Australia, Europeans eventually made their way down there, and what did they find? Black swans. The fact that every swan they had observed was white was not good reason. It didn't necessarily entail that the next swan they were going to see was going to be white. It's always possible that the next swan is a different color. Just because every piece of bread you've ever eaten has given you nourishment instead of killed you, it doesn't mean that the next one, by necessity, has to give you nourishment. It's always possible it could kill you. In the same way, just because every day that you've been alive the sun has risen, it doesn't mean that tomorrow the sun must rise. Your past experience doesn't necessitate that the future is going to pan out the way you think it will. It could be different. When talking about this problem, a philosopher named Bertrand Russell uses an example of a turkey. So, the turkey, every day the farmer comes out and feeds them. So the turkey starts to reason after this happens day after day after day. The farmer really likes me because every day he comes out and feeds me. So the next day, every day when the farmer comes out, the turkey thinks the farmer is coming to feed me. Is the turkey always going to be right? What's going to happen one day? The farmer's not going to come out with feed, he's going to come out with an axe. And then it will not be a good day for that turkey. Past experience does not necessarily tell you about the future. It only tells you about the past. So you might say, okay, wait. But so you're telling me that you can't make an absolutely certain argument that the past tells us about the future. Well, nobody thinks that it's absolutely certain. Why not say it's a probable argument? And that the probable argument is more based on the fact that our inductive reasoning has been successful in the past. In other words, in the past, whenever I've made an inference that the unobserved thing will be like what I've observed, it almost always works out that way. And I've done this in the past several times, and every time in the past I've done this, or most of the time I've done this in the past, this inductive way of reasoning pans out. That's not going to work either. Let's take a look at what Hume says on 546. And this is, in particular, at the very end, he talks about this creating reasoning in a circle. So this is the I want to read that whole paragraph. That's the first full one on the right side. He says, if we are therefore engaged by arguments to put trust in past experience and make it the standard of our future judgment, these arguments must be probable only, or such as regard matter of fact and real existence according to the division above mentioned. But that there is no argument of this kind must appear if our explication of that species of reasoning is admitted as solid and satisfactory. We have said that all arguments concerning existence are founded on the relation of cause and effect, that our knowledge of that relation is derived entirely from experience, and that all of our experimental conclusions proceed upon the supposition that the future will be conformable to the past. To endeavor, therefore, the proof of this last supposition by probable arguments, or arguments regarding facts, regarding existence, must be evidently going in a circle and taking that which is the very point in question for granted. Let me see if I can illustrate how this is arguing in a circle, how this is not going to work. This is what we're trying to do, right? In my past observed experience, it has always been the case that unobserved things will resemble observed things. So, in my future experience, that which I've yet to observe, the unobservable things will resemble the observable things. This is circular because to get from claim number 1 to the conclusion, you have to assume this. Unobserved things will resemble observed things. That's the only way you can connect that first claim to the conclusion. If you think about it, something like that is the only way you're going to get that done. But this claim I've got underlined here, that's essentially the conclusion itself. So if I try to say, well, look, in the past, all of my inductive reasoning has been successful, therefore I can trust my next instance of inductive reasoning, Hume is going to step in and say, no, you can't. You can't make that argument. You just use the conclusion to prove the conclusion. You've just said that my next instance of induction will be like my previous instance of induction. The unobserved instance of induction will resemble the observed case of induction. But so you can't make this case at all without assuming the very point you're trying to prove. Let me go back real fast. Does this make sense about the circularity issue I'm trying to highlight here? Because Hume, despite his faults, he is right about this. I don't think that there's anyone that doubts that he's making the right criticism of people who might be trying to use induction to prove induction. Are there any questions about what we're doing right now with this? Is this making some sense? I'll give you a chance to fire back at Hume, and maybe give you a chance to see how we can, if there is a way to make a case for inductive reasoning. Maybe I should give you the summary. So here's our big summary of how the problem that he's raising. So in the first case, we showed that you can't make the claim that unobserved things will resemble observed things on the basis of relations of ideas. And you can't prove that through experience or by matter of fact. And thirdly, there's no other way that you could even think about this. It's either a matter of fact or a relation of ideas. So if there's no other way to know or justify that unobserved things will resemble observed things, then it follows, well, then there's just no way to know or be justified in believing that unobserved things will resemble observed things. Which means that the next time you get in your car, if you're going somewhere tonight, put the key in, and you think, I am perfectly justified, and it is a reasonable thing for me to think when I turn this that my car will start. Hume says you have no rational basis for that. That your belief that it will start is just as well founded as somebody's belief that when you turn that, clowns will rush into your car and jump in as well. That your belief that when you turn the key it'll start your car is just as well founded that when you turn the car it'll start raining inside your car. There is no reasonable basis for making these beliefs, for holding these kinds of beliefs. But here's the crazy thing. Inductive reasoning underlies everything you do that really matters in life. Like you set your alarm to wake up in the morning. Why do you think it's going to wake you up? Because in the past it's woken you up. You think when you study and prepare for an exam that it will help you on the exam. Why? Because in the past that's helped. You think that you give somebody money in exchange for food, that they're going to give you the food. Why? Because that's the way it's always worked in the past. You can't. There are very few significant beliefs that you can think of that don't rely on this. So if Hume is right, he is saying for just about every belief we hold that is of significance to us, there's no rational basis for it. Now let me maybe put the ball back in your court for a moment. Maybe ask, what do you think about this? Like, do you think he's right? Or maybe secondly, sometimes through these questions and answers, we can get a better understanding of what he's even claiming here. So, what are you thinking about? Yeah.
I feel like he takes the minority of things that do change and applies them to everything that might not change ever, but still says it's wrong, just because a little bit of things did.
One thing to see what he's doing, he's not arguing because every now and then it has failed us that it's unreasonable. So he's not kind of doing like a Descartes kind of thing, where you might say, well, in the past, one time it was wrong, like the Swan case or something. Therefore, you can't trust the future. It's more along the ideas that just by contemplating what we do know, there's nothing to guarantee that the next time it will help us. Is everyone content with being told that most of your beliefs are held unreasonably? Yeah.
This is a bit outside of this, but in mathematics, I'm a math major, I learned that most of what we know about numbers is determined from induction from axioms.
Mm-hmm.
So if he's doubting induction, then he's doubting most of mathematics.
So yeah, being able to prove the consistency and completeness of mathematical systems would be done as well. He might be okay with that.
Why? What is the difference in this case?
Well, he would still be fine with, because you wouldn't have to throw out all of your beliefs of math. You just have to throw out your beliefs about the completeness and consistency of entire mathematical systems. So those higher order beliefs about the systems of mathematics, he says, yeah, maybe we can doubt that. But that doesn't require him to give up 2 + 3 = 5, or that the interior angles of a triangle have to add up to 2 right angles. If you sit down with your family over Easter and they have, I don't know if you like to do a traditional meal, something like turkey or ham, or smells good, and you're about to bite into it, you should think, Hume says, I don't know what this is going to taste like. I have no clue. That for all I know, I could put this in my mouth and it could taste like dog poo. Share that with your family over your gatherings this weekend. Hume doesn't leave us in the lurch here. He does have some kind of answer, although what I want to press you to think about is whether this is a good answer. Hume's answer is what he calls custom or habit. And I want to read a little bit of 549 here, and my question to you is to articulate what he's saying here. How does custom or habit explain our inductive reasoning? So look on the right column and the first full paragraph there. So he said. So here's going to describe his answer. He says, "This principle is custom or habit. For wherever the repetition of any particular act or operation produces a propensity to renew the same act or operation without being impelled by any reasoning or process of the understanding, we always say that this propensity is the effect of custom. By employing that word, we pretend not to have given the ultimate reason of such a propensity. We only point out a principle of human nature which is universally acknowledged and which is well known by its effects." So what does this sound like to you? How is this supposed to explain our cause and effect reasoning, our inductive reasoning here? Sarah?
Well, it's saying like, with like things that we're doing, we're just making the same act because we've already done it before, so it like becomes a custom or like a habit, like brushing your teeth or stuff like that. Washing your hands.
It's just something
You do.
we do over and over again, and we get accustomed to it, we get habituated to it. Most of you probably know about the famous psychologist Pavlov, right? That Pavlov, he was able to train dogs to salivate at the ringing of a bell. How did he do that? What's that?
You would give them food when you rang the bell.
So at first, with the dogs, if you go up to a dog and you ring a bell, do they salivate? So how did he
was like, when he was giving them food, he would ring the bell and they would make the connection between the two. So after a while, they just assumed they were getting.
So after a while, all he had to do was ring the bell and they thought, I'm getting food. Because the two things were just constantly put together. In the same way, Hume is essentially saying that's what we are constantly doing. That when you put the key in the ignition and you expect that car to start, it's not because you thought it through and you're a really smart person and know that your past experience somehow makes it probable that your future experience will be the same. It's just custom. It just is something you've been, the way I would put it, you've been conditioned to believe. So, the repetition of any particular act or operation produces a propensity to renew the same act or operation. But the key thing is to remember that it is without being impelled by any reasoning or process of the understanding. It's not like you're intelligently figuring this out. Hume says, really all that's going on here, you've been conditioned. And we as a race of people, that's what this is the way all of our reasoning works about cause and effect. It's just conditioning. It gives us a psychological expectation, but it provides us with no rational grounds. Another way he puts this on the very top of 550 is when he says, all inference from experience therefore are effects of custom and not of reasoning. So he still says there's no hope of like giving a rational answer to the problem of induction. There's still no way in which we are able to come up with some premise or some claim that shows how we can go from past experience to future experience. It's just, we've been accustomed to that. We've been trained to do it. We expect it as a matter of psychology. What do you think about that? Is that a satisfying solution to the problem?
Seems a bit weak.
Why do you say it's weak?
I don't know, I mean, he's like bringing down everything that we thought was true, and then all he's saying is that we're used to it.
Seems pretty weak. Anybody think that maybe there is something better to be taken from this? I've tried to depict it as pretty weak. Is there maybe a better way to take this?
Kind of makes sense.
What's that?
Kind of just makes sense to me.
In what way?
Well, like the one day I just went to start my car and it didn't start for no reason. So I just assumed it was going to start, but when it didn't, I was like completely thrown off. I'm used to it starting. And it's like a new car, so it's like I don't think it would not start.
Yeah.
It's just we're used to everything, I guess.
It's like one time my wife got, I was doing yard work and she said, the car's not starting. My first thought is, you're not doing something right. Yeah. One of the things with our car, the one that she primarily drives, like the steering wheel, if it's locked, for instance, it won't start, so you have to kind of turn the steering wheel as you get it. And I was thinking, oh, it's probably that thing. But it turned out, actually, that we had a bad starter. So, once again, it's this sort of thing, like we have certain expectations that almost give us a sense of confidence about things. But does it bother you that this sense of confidence isn't really grounded in anything rational, that it's just this kind of psychological expectation? I mean, if everything that is really important to us is like this, doesn't that mean almost everything that's important to us is just like that? It could go kaput just like your car.
Well, yeah. Like, I mean, you can go to bed thinking you're going to wake up and have all those plans and like die in your sleep. It sounds bad, but it's true.
I mean, everything could fall apart no matter what, so I guess it does make sense.
There are no guarantees in life. And that's true, but I always wonder, isn't there something to be said about, isn't it still reasonable to think otherwise? Like, sure, I could go to bed tonight and die. But is that just as reasonable as thinking I will go to bed and wake up tomorrow? Isn't there something more reasonable about the claim that I will wake up to live another day? Yeah, the other Brian.
Well, can't you say that like going back to the car example, cars are built so that they will start. So for that reason, can't you say then that it has more of a possibility of starting than not starting?
So this would come back to then saying, well, how do you know? Like, so you talk about they were built to start. Like, what does that mean? That, well, according to certain like laws of physics and other things, right? So how do you know that the laws of physics aren't going to change tomorrow? So the assumption is the laws of physics are going to stay the same no matter what. But Hume would say the only reason you think that is because in the past they haven't changed. But there's nothing inconsistent about the thought that tomorrow morning we'll wake up and gravity is different. That the law of electromagnetism is different. Yeah?
I just a question. Is it possible that we're using the word could to, like, vaguely? Because what if it's what we're saying is possible, just cannot happen? Like, it's not, it actually is impossible. Like birds can't have like laser beams shooting out of their eyes. Mm-hmm. But according to this, that could happen, but it's not possible.
And part of this is based on some deeper things Hume says about cause and effect. That for him, causation really just is a matter of closely connected events. So, I mean, for him, that's all you need for one thing to be the cause of another thing. Some people think that there needs to be something more than that just closely connected events that continuously happen is not enough to give you causation. But, if you're thinking like there needs to be some kind of like productive force, some kind of productive ability between the cause and the effect. So when you say birds can't shoot laser beams out of their eyes, it's because you're saying because there needs to be some mechanism that produces laser beams and they don't have that.
Yeah.
Although we might say, well, maybe if the laws of physics all changed, maybe they would have the means for doing this. It just couldn't happen under the current.
Well, we don't know that the laws of physics could change. That's another could.
Mm-hmm.
We don't. How do we know that's a possibility? That might be impossible.
Hume would only ask you to say, if you do have the view, if it truly is impossible for the laws of physics to change, it's incumbent on you to show that. If you can't show it, then that doesn't give us the demonstration. He's working under what we philosophers call epistemic possibility. Epistemic possibility is the idea that for all we know, this could be the case. But there's another kind of possibility, which is called metaphysical possibility. Metaphysical possibility is, given the way reality actually is, could things have been different? So we sometimes say, epistemically, it's possible that water has some other chemical formula than H2O. Like, we could imagine that tomorrow chemists all around the world say, there's been a Copernican revolution in chemistry. Water is not really H2O. It's actually got a different chemical formula. In fact, all of our periodic table and everything we put into that, it's all wrong. There's a whole new way of thinking about chemistry. But given the way the world actually is, water couldn't be anything else but H2O. Like, H2O is what water is. So Hume is thinking more in the first sense, that you can imagine water is different than it actually is. I don't know, do I have another slide? No. Okay. So that is Hume on induction. And that's really the main thing I'm going to ask you to take away from Hume. And this is a real serious skeptical problem. So, next week, of course, I'll be posting essay questions. The one that will be posted about Hume will definitely be about this problem. Are there any questions about the setup of the problem or the responses to it that you think would be helpful in you being as prepared as you would like to be to think about that? Then let's take a short break, and we will do our last bit of the reading, which will not take another hour. So let's go ahead and stretch our legs, take a brief break. Let's be back at 7:22, and then we'll wrap up today's class.